Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm the token social behavioral scientist here, and I'm supposed to represent all of social and behavioral sciences, which is amusing on multiple fronts. The first one is that some of my work focuses on evaluating how bad social behavioral scientists are at predicting the future. And there are a whole range of misconceptions about it. We have weird models. There's a lot of stochasticity in our models. We misunderstand levels of analysis when making inferences. We overfit our data, so to say, or don't understand that our tiny little theory may not actually explain the whole world. So that's all interesting. And this is my prefacing. So whatever I'll be saying here is probably going to be wrong, as most predictions are. In addition to that, to really, when I started thinking about it seriously, knowing a little bit about forecasting and trying to track societal changes in the past, one realization is that you always have to put some constraints to reduce this dramatic degree of uncertainty. And so here are some constraints about social sciences that some of you probably know about. Number one is social sciences as research offices are stagnant and resistant to change. AI, what is AI? Never heard of it. Often there is a worry in social sciences that natural sciences will just co-opt the topics and start doing them because they are much faster at innovating. Whereas we, if you look at it, I looked at some of the predictions from 50 or 60 years ago, and it seems like people are talking about the same things. The worries are the same. And the worries are divestment of government funding, where right now social sciences are not very hot. And especially in the United States, but also in other countries, in the UK, the funding rate is very low, so that many social behavioral scientists have to look for alternative sources, often from companies or private foundations that have particular agendas and would motivate particular topics that are not necessarily about the interests of a scientist per se, however idiosyncratic it may be, but certain agendas. Number three, and this is also something that you would see throughout the last 100 years. When you open something about social science, status now, status in 10 years, they will be lamenting about what is the meaning of social science? What is the model? What are the incentive structures? And right now, of course, we have a certain shift. We have experienced in the last 10 years, it is an ongoing process of openness, where I think social sciences actually have been on the forefront of that with Open Science Framework and other innovations. There is a greater focus on social scientists being not only a researcher, basic scientist, but also a communicator. And there is also an orientation towards the social scientist as an activist. Something that has not been as much in the forefront, at least since the 60s, probably, when a lot of people came here again, across social sciences. Okay, so those are the constraints. And with those constraints, I want to think about three scenarios. And I already mentioned to one of the earlier presenter that I actually don't like doing scenario studies because they are highly speculative. But I already mentioned to you that social scientists can't predict the future anyway, so whatever. So the three scenarios will deal with human welfare orientation, geopolitics, and of course, the AI-driven revolution. And this is not something, I mean, so when I think, for instance, that social sciences are pretty stagnant and don't really change that much, so that's literally what's probably happening right now in the next year. And then you can extrapolate from that, that we'll have just maybe 10, 15% more of that in 10 years. Okay, what do I mean with the first one? Well, as we already heard from the previous presentation, there is some concern with the Sustainable Development Goals, with various forms of inequalities, prejudice, as well as polarization that has been on the minds of many social behavioral scientists in the last 5 to 10 years. And that, of course, will only continue. So there is, I talked to a number of presidents from scientific society, specifically in one of the subfields I belong to, social psychology. And there is a shared sentiment that one of the things that seem to be going in slightly different direction than before is that a lot of members of the future generation of social scientists are more interested in introducing some change, positive change in our societies than as much as in the basic science itself. And that's fine. For instance, again, social psychology for a long time has a whole string of more applied division of how to deal with some particular problems, how to improve the human conditions, or understand the various challenges we're dealing with. A lot of people became social psychologists after the Second World War, for instance. The other obvious reason is climate change induced volatilities and related processes that will only be exacerbated due to a shortage of resources, be it related to migration or economic and health related consequences, where I can imagine that in the 10 years we'll see much greater prominence of these topics. And as I already mentioned, general practical applications. Instead of just studying some basics of prejudice, how about prejudice in prison systems? Instead of just studying basic understanding of environmental stressors for this particular community in this particular region in the world. That's one scenario. The second scenario, and that's getting kind of morbid, is if you think about where the standard publishing and academic model emerged since the Second World War ended and the Cold War started, we had a particular ecosystem with I guess there were two major superpowers, and scientists somehow tried to communicate from both sides, but we had our ecosystem here. The Soviets had their ecosystem. But now, since the 90s, of course, the world changed, and now it's changing again. And we don't know yet what direction, but let's assume that it will be changing towards either some kind of multipolar world in a geopolitical foci, or towards a cryptocracy, where instead of particular states and powers like here, dictating what science should be funded or not, but instead of that, companies dictating what science should be funded or not, where social science in particular may be advancing in corporate environments and classified governmental labs to protect certain interests. And of course, you can see that doesn't necessarily go in the same direction as all the discussion about openness that we have and transparency would go. There's very little incentive for openness if you work in a corporate environment. You, in fact, don't want to share your code. You don't want to share your data. You don't want to tell anybody where you took that data from. And very similarly, if you work in a classified lab. So will we see an increase in that? I don't know, but that's a scenario. Finally, the last one is, of course, I have to talk about the AI. Everybody else does, in part because I'm here because I wrote the science piece last year talking about how AI may be transforming social sciences. One thing that didn't make it into this piece is that essentially I wanted really this figure to be in there, but they told me no figures. This is fine. 800 words or something like that, 1,000 something. But what's interesting is some of the things when I thought about them, it seemed science fiction. And then the reviewers already said that, no, we already done this. This is old news. And other things became the reality already. So this is already probably obsolete. But essentially, we can probably expect that many more will follow in one of these directions where AI in social behavioral sciences can be used as almost some kind of a silicon surrogate for pre-testing your studies, for as an interactionist in your human AI sort of experiments, and as an aid in research, be it for screening through publications or some other means. And of course, we'll have also interdisciplinary teams. So let me go just quickly through this and tell you some scenarios here. One thing that I thought is a science fiction, and this is sort of like probably not applicable to all fields, but others have already demonstrated that it's theoretically in limited capacity possible is that you'll have so-called AI surrogates that would simulate data sets to provide some direct answers to research questions about the relationship between different constructs that you're interested in, and saving, at least for pilot testing of materials, some time and resources. The idea here is that in the standard social science model, of course, is that we're not interested in individual humans. We always sample humans to have a representation, so-called nomothetic idealization of human processes. And in that sense, whether it is a pre-trained model on a large scale, or it is your survey that is hardly representative ever, you're probably dealing with the same concerns, namely representation. And we'll get to that in a second. Example, imagine you want to study impact of political ideology and message frames on adherence to public health guidelines. Sounds familiar, probably. The pandemic, a great interest in that. And you would generate responses to different messages with different frames for different demographic groups. Then you'll get some synthetic data set, and you can test whether certain, for instance, political differences in responses may exist, and what frames would be better suited for this group versus that group. If it sounds like science fiction, it has already been implemented in principle. The proof of concepts of this that have existed for the last half a year. Another more esoteric thing is discovery of some kind of emergent properties. So you will, by emergent properties, I mean it's novel high-level phenomena that arise from the interaction of lower-level components in the system. And essentially the idea is that you would sort of cross different concepts, and an AI would think through how to generate hypotheses about them, generate some data for testing those hypotheses in the simulation, and give you some pointers in different directions. And this is also, again, interesting for theory generation, pilot testing, very different from how we currently train students or do research, business as usual model. And if that sounds like science fiction, here's an arXiv preprint from last week, where they literally create a pipeline to show proof of concept of that, where in an AI system, you would specify a scenario, generate hypothesis, build an agent, create interaction between those agents, and then run an experiment, collect the data, and then estimate the model. All of that within the AI ecosystem, very, very different from how currently social science works. Now, of course, all of this has huge challenges. And I've written about this, but many people before me have written about it. Many people after me have written about it, continue writing about it. And the challenges themselves represent a whole field, an opportunity for social behavioral science research, namely the challenges of bias in representation of subpopulation in the training data. Where does this data come from? Well, as the previous speaker alluded to already. Was there bias in design and development due to some societal disparities because a particular group is underrepresented? Now, the same question, of course, applies to human participants that we are gathering data from. But somehow, when you're dealing with AI, it sounds more artificial, so you're more likely to disprove why that is a bad method. And with humans, you're thinking that's okay, because I've been doing that for a while. Generally, there is a scientist-humanist dilemma, of course, where an engineer, when they develop an AI system, like generative AI systems that are commercially available right now, they want to align it with a world that is potentially less harming. And if you just pre-train the model, an AI model, or with large language model, on online Reddit texts, it will sound like an angry white man that adheres to a particular political ideology, that you don't want an AI system to sound like that. You maybe want it to be more diverse, friendlier, and so on. But that is, of course, a problem for social scientists, because if you want to use a model, you want the model to be representing the world as is. And there's this dilemma between the two. Do you want the world as is? As a scientist, I say yes. And as somebody who is an engineer or has a strong investment in not developing another fascist bot like Microsoft had for a few seconds, then you would be thinking twice before you unleash something like that. And finally, of course, you have the black boxiness versus model reproducibility and transparency. Most of the commercial models are opaque, and some advances have been made in making AI system explainable, but we are not quite there yet. And in fact, you need like GPT-5 or GPT-6 in order to explain GPT-3, because the current GPT-4 can explain GPT-2. See what I'm saying? So it's kind of hard. People also afraid that GPT-5 or GPT-6 will have some kind of AGI properties, though I think that's probably a little bit far-fetched. Generally, though, there's also this kind of illusion of understanding. You feel like you're interacting with a machine, and now you can do things that you couldn't do before. You can't really do them, but you feel like the machine helps you to do some crazy advances. Now I can do agent-based modeling. I never heard of this before, but hey, with 5 seconds, I'm a master in Python or some other computer language, because the generative AI gives you an output. And that, in turn, creates an interesting psychological phenomenon where you feel like you know, whereas in reality, you know less. And that's a big problem. This kind of illusion of understanding is a big problem. And the other problem is, and I again wrote about this in the science piece, if you want a little philosophy. So look, so AI is a cultural, it's trained on cultural products, be it text, be it images, videos, and so on. But those are cultural products, and it's a generalization. And it tries to generalize, let's say, from that to our human experience, or maybe something neuropsychological even. When you ask it to generate some output. But of course, those are just shadows, and they may not really represent the whole range of human experience. And so from the social behavioral science perspective, that is a limitation, that there is this distortion. Now, consequently, when we think about those biases and opportunities, what kind of social scientists would we have then in the future? Well, one group that is not there right now is so-called bias hunters, where they would be trying to look into the models and figure out what kind of biases are inherent in them. And we already see that. Every day you see new archive preprints on this topic, either in computer science, data science, or at the intersection of those and social sciences. I would call them AI ecologists, a new discipline that is probably going to emerge, has already sort of started, to study the psychology or pseudopsychology of artificial agents. The other group is simulators. This is basically an extension on a new age agent-based modeling approaches that have existed in social sciences, complex systems for the last 20, 30 years, but have now a few new tricks upon their sleeve. Because the systems are limited and not everything is present in the training set, you will, by necessity, will need also so-called diversity seekers, either within corporations or in the basic science, where you will have people going out to document and get representations from different groups. And I probably don't have to explain why that is important. And finally, you will always have a group of what I would call computational irreducibility objectors. That is people who would never say never, never, or Luddites if you want. But I think there are probably some fields where you would say, no, we cannot do it with AI. I'm studying babies. And I cannot replace the baby with AI. I have to do it in the lab. And that's actually a good thing, because in the last decade in social science, we had a great push towards getting larger samples. But that came at the expense of doing higher quality research in the lab. And I think for some fields, you need that lab-based experience. Of course, throughout all of this, you need interdisciplinary skills. You need computational skills. Most social sciences under-train students or don't train them enough in computational skills. That will continue to be a problem probably for the next 5 to 10 years. Implications. One thing for social behavioral sciences is that right now, in some fields, over 90% relies on so-called crowd-working survey platforms like Amazon Mechanical Turk or Prolific or other platforms where you pay people to do quick surveys or experiments online for pennies. That will probably cease to exist in the current form, even though it's shocking because it was a great advance. Until that moment, those platforms emerged, people just relied on subject pool studies on undergraduates at Yale, at Harvard. And you can see what problems we have with that, of course. Now, if you cannot validate if the response is coming from a human or from somebody who just hooked up an AI system to spit out responses and fill out questionnaires for you, how can we move forward with online crowd-working platforms? I don't think we can, at least in the current state. I think there'll be greater focus, and this is my aspiration, like talked about aspiration, there'll be greater focus not just on explanations, which often are overfitted, because social scientists can explain everything, but they can't predict anything, apparently. Our causal models are always like post hoc. And I hope that there will be greater focus on introducing predictions into our field within the next 10 years. And finally, there will always, because of the societal shocks, such as, laying off a bunch of white-collar workers in different strata or in different countries, we'll probably have a lot of social scientists just studying those phenomena in the same way how social science in general emerged as a response to industrial revolution. Okay, now let me just finish by talking a tiny bit about concerns and hopes, and then we can all gather here. If you're talking about the geopolitics, well, how will this disrupt established publication models and academic incentives? If suddenly different spheres of influence want to publish only in particular geopolitical journals or geopolitically aligned journals? I don't know, but that is a concern. If we have an AI-driven democratization of publishing, which is great, if everybody suddenly can do research by themselves, can do their own research, which sounds great, but that term is also associated with not so great consequences, that broadens participation. So that's a plus. But at the same time, it also introduces this illusion of understanding that I mentioned earlier and overwhelms already barely functioning peer review systems, where we can't even get people to be reviewers for our journals, who don't even respond. And especially if you sort of like allow people who may not be able to master the language, currently sort of our lingua franca English, instead of, even though they cannot really, let's say, write in perfect English, they would use an AI proof editor who would then be able to translate that manuscript into something that's passable. Imagine that that increases by 1/3 the number of submissions in social behavioral sciences without having a corresponding increase in peer reviewers. That's it. What are we going to do? I don't know. I'm just pointing out. So there is this hope, and I think that was shared earlier too, with there is a replication crisis in social behavioral sciences, where I think actually what's on the positive side, that AI systems can help us standardize and enforce more robust research practices. For instance, we focus more on pre-registration right now, checking protocols if they correspond to what people said they would do in advance, checking analytical procedures. Right now, reviewers are trying to do that, some of them, and it's burdensome already. But if you have a system that can allow you to do it and introduce it in the pipeline, I think that can be a great promise and can really help social scientists. And finally, I already mentioned the democratization of knowledge. The AI and online platforms in general could democratize data collection and theory development. But And that's great. That potentially can redefine scientific authority and prestige, and there are pluses to that. But at the same time, it can lead to what I would describe as epistemic vigilance and reduction in trust, because everybody can generate their own truth, where deep fakes are everywhere, and you cannot even know for sure if the person whom you're getting a call from, your friend, is actually your friend. So you actually need the password before you can continue the conversation, which is a legitimate concern already now. But scale this up to the whole scientific enterprise and try to figure out what would be the world in which you can trust anything, and where everybody can do their own research promoted by this kind of AI systems. That is, of course, a big concern. And again, I hope that we'll figure out a way in social behavioral sciences to navigate that. That's all, but if you have questions, please email me.